Hank Paulson was the former head of Goldman Sachs. When he left that company, he left with $500 million. He then later became Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. And he then was forced into, he claims, forced into bailing out some of the largest financial companies in the country, including Goldman Sachs. But not only did he bail them out directly, but he also gave them an indirect bailout through AIG. And they wind up paying off $13 billion to Goldman Sachs, 100 cents on the dollar when they could only get about 20 cents on the dollar in the open market. So he was critical in funneling a tremendous amount of money to his former company for some of the stuff that he himself had sold to AIG. Okay. So understanding this background, Hank Paulson, of course, in the mainstream media is treated as literally a king. There was a very famous magazine cover of King Henry. And they said that he saved the country from recession, depression, etc. Now, Hank Paulson is back arguing for financial reform in the New York Times opinion section. And you say, that's interesting. Well, he's looking for financial reform. But is he really? That's the question at hand. Okay? And in the beginning of the article, he says, look, if I didn't act and we hadn't done the bailout, we would have had 25% unemployment. Boo. So that's supposed to scare us. Oh, okay, then funnel any money you like to Goldman Sachs. So he goes on to explain about how we need to act and we need financial reform. Now I'm reading this and I'm thinking, well, look, I don't care where he comes from. If he's on the right side, I'm happy to have his assistance in doing the right kind of financial reform. But as you read on in the opinion piece, you begin to realize that is not his intent at all. So now I can go through the whole piece, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down one long paragraph here and tell you what he's saying and what he's meaning. So let's start. He says here, winding down a large institution is difficult and time-consuming. The regulators with this responsibility will need to be trained to do the job. Let's stop there for a second. Now, so far that sounds pretty good. It's time-consuming and difficult job. That's true. And the regulators need to be trained to do this job. They have to have specific expertise. Okay, now the translation. The translation is, you need to hire people from Wall Street because they're the only people with sufficient expertise to do this very complicated job that you simpletons wouldn't understand. Now, those Wall Street guys will wind up helping their own companies, but look the other way because you wouldn't understand because it's so damn complicated. Now, how do I know that that's part of where they're going? Because that's exactly what he did before. He hired a guy named Dan Jester who still had money invested in Goldman Sachs to decide how much money should go to Goldman Sachs from AIG. Okay, but very complicated. Only Dan Jester could understand it. Let's continue. He says, and we must also require all large firms to develop a roadmap for their liquidation well ahead of any failure. Well, that again sounds pretty good, right? These are not the only necessary reforms. We must also address regulation of derivatives and our over-reliance on credit ratings agencies. Now, I'm thinking, well, that actually is great. Credit rating agencies is a problem. Derivatives is a major problem. He's identified that. And you got to have the banks have a plan for if something goes wrong. All this sounds really good. So if he means it, let's go to the next sentence. He says, over time, we have to simplify the patchwork of quilt of regulatory agencies and improve transparency so that consumers and investors can punish excesses through their own informed investing decisions. Pause. So it turns out, no. You don't want the government regulating these guys, whether it's the derivatives or the credit rating agencies. It's a patchwork of quilt of regulatory agencies. No. They're no good at it. Now, let's be a little bit more transparent. Let's keep doing it, but show you a little piece of it so that investors can make their own decisions. In other words, let the market decide. Now, that's exactly how we got into this mess in the first place. When they said, no, we're brilliant. We know how to take risk and when not to take risk. You think we want to crash our own companies? We don't want to crash. And these investors are very savvy. And they'll be able to tell if we're doing something wrong and they'll take money out of our companies. Now, none of that proved to be true. The investors were not savvy. They didn't mind crashing their own companies because all anybody ever wanted to do was get the bonuses like Hank Paulson, right? So what he's arguing for is let's go back to doing things the old way where we let the companies decide for themselves without any refs or cops to tell them what they can and cannot do. So let's continue now. He says, we have to examine the many policies that favor home ownership and recalibrate our support for them. We must also tackle what is by far our greatest economic challenge, the reduction of budget deficits, a big part of which will involve reforming our major entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Aha. If it wasn't bad enough that he only wants the Wall Street guys to, quote-unquote, be in charge of regulating and reforming Wall Street, and if it wasn't bad enough that he's saying, just let Wall Street handle it, these savvy guys will be able to regulate themselves. In the end, he's saying, look, we do need money. Where should we get the money from? Well, of course, the poor and the middle class. It's time to go rob them again. So his answer to all the problem is, cut the budget. And how do you cut it? Cut it by taking away the rights of the middle class and the poor. Now, I say rights because we paid into Social Security. We paid into Medicare. And by the way, here's the most important part of this. Social Security has been running a gigantic surplus for decades. Do you ever hear that in the news? Not that often, right? What you hear is Social Security's in trouble. It's in trouble. We got to cut it. We got to cut it. No, the reality is it ran an enormous surplus. The problem is the politicians already spent that surplus. So now they're saying, well, we're running out of money. Yeah, that's because you shouldn't have spent it in the first place. But you did. You raided Social Security, which was supposed to be for our economic security, for the middle class of this country, when they retire. And you took all that money. And where did you spend that money? On senseless wars, which went to defense contractors. You spent it on, TARP bailout. That went to the richest people in the country, including Hank Paulson, his former company, and all his friends. So it's exactly reverse Robin Hood. They took from the poor and the middle class, and they want to keep taking, and they want to give it to the rich. And then when the money runs out, they go, well, where are we going to go? We're going to raid your Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and that's where we're going to take it from. And the next time there's trouble, well, we're going to say, oh, look at that, the free market didn't work, but don't worry, the answer is more deregulation, so we can keep on robbing you more and more. Hank Paulson is one of the biggest culprits of this whole thing. He's the one that that put together the toxic assets at Goldman Sachs in the first place. His company then sold them to AIG, sold them to other places, I should say, made tremendous money off of it, and then insured it with AIG. And then when all those toxic assets were in fact toxic, they turned around to AIG and said, give me all the money for that insurance because I knew that stuff was crap. Well, how did you know it was crap? Because Hank Paulson built it as crap in the first place. And then that allowed you to make the bet saying, oh, I bet it's crappy. And then Hank Paulson becomes the Treasury Secretary and says, well, no, we got to pay off that bet. Even though Goldman Sachs knew that stuff was crap, and I was the head of Goldman Sachs, we insured against it so we get paid off if they went under. So we made money selling them, and we make some money when they go under. How do we do that? Well, if Hank Paulson's the head of Goldman Sachs, then turns around and becomes the head of the Treasury Department, and he makes that ultimate decision, well, it becomes really, really easy. And now when you need to do regulation so that scam doesn't happen again, look at that, it's Hank Paulson again, and he tells you, don't worry, let Wall Street make its own decisions, and if we need to raid more people's money, well, of course we won't touch the rich and my friends. We'll touch your Social Security and your Medicare, and we'll take all that money and cut deficits, cut the budget, and cut too much social spending. Look, I say this all the time. It doesn't matter if you're a conservative or a liberal or a libertarian or anything. No one should be in favor of this highway robbery. If you're a conservative, why do you want Hank Paulson taking your Social Security? Are you crazy? If you're a libertarian, maybe you didn't like putting money into Medicare, but now you did, okay? And that money is yours. They should have stored that away for you. Instead, Hank Paulson wants to come and steal it again. How stupid do you have to be to let him do that? These titans of industry and the politicians who are in their back pockets, they're not here to help you. They're here to rob you. Don't let them do it. And don't let them drive this nonsense agenda about how Social Security is bankrupt and Medicare is in a lot of trouble. And the only answer is to cut your payments of those so you don't get paid and they do. It's highway robbery.